We have seen that Satanism can be linked to dope and to pornography, child abuse, and to murder. It has led seemingly normal teenagers into monstrous behavior.
You're gonna burn in hell. I'll burn in hell.
There's power in Satan.
The 1980s were a decade of big hair, bright outfits, and unique music. But beneath its neon colors and loud fashion statements, there was a fever brewing. Later known as the Satanic Panic, it was a phenomena that seeped into the very psyche of a nation, creating a torrent of sensational charges and moral uproar. Powerful media personalities like Geraldo Rivera and Oprah Winfrey had tremendous influence on public sentiment during this period. Their talk shows, characterized by dramatic tales and emotionally charged interviews, ushered the Satanic Panic right into the heart of American homes, giving it a sense of urgency.
To say this as straight as I possibly can, I am begging you, if you're a parent and you've got kids there, that this subject is just too upsetting for your young children. Please get them out of the room or change the station.
One of the things caught up in this whirlwind of fear was the heavy metal music genre. Bands like Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest came under intense scrutiny. Their lyrics, characterized by rebellious and sometimes dark themes, became the subject of widespread concern. The fear stemmed from suspicions that these songs were embedded with subliminal messages that promoted satanic worship. As a result, heavy metal music was labeled as a moral hazard, fueling the hysteria that was already raging. Amid this escalating panic, many parents succumbed to the belief that satanic cults were lurking in the most unassuming corners. A place called Azteca Woods in Northport, New York was one of them. Northport is a historic maritime village on Long Island's North Shore. It was first settled by English Puritans in the 17th century, who feared and hated anything perceived to be related to witchcraft. In the early 20th century, some people believed that the town had a link to Aleister Crowley, a notorious occultist and magician who lived in New York for a while. In the 1970s, a witchcraft museum opened in the town, and stories circulated of rituals taking place in the woods. There was a weird abandoned building there, with stone floors and arches. Was it an old church? A half-built orphanage? The local teens didn't care. They thought it was the ideal place to party, deep in the woods where no one would bother them. Richard Kasso Jr. was born on March 29, 1967, the only boy in a family of 4 children. His father was a teacher and a coach who wanted his kids to love sports as much as he did. His mother was a homemaker who cared for Ricky and his 3 sisters. Ricky's childhood seemed normal at first, but when he was in the 8th grade, he rebelled. He would sneak off after football practice and smoke pot. He made friends with the wrong crowd and got into trouble at school. He rejected the jock culture and was a self-proclaimed dirtbag. He even broke into a neighbor's house with his buddies, but they got caught. His parents then found out about his drug habit and sent him to counseling. But Ricky didn't care. He kept doing drugs, especially mescaline. He showed up to his counseling sessions high. He skipped school, got into fights, and had run-ins with the cops. He was on a very different path than his family had hoped for him. Ricky's parents tried different ways to help him with his drug and mental problems, but none of them worked. First, they considered sending him to a special school for adolescents with substance abuse and behavioral issues. However, Ricky skipped the interview and ran away for 2 weeks. Then they sought help from South Oaks, a local facility that offered drug rehabilitation and mental health services for troubled youth in the 80s. A court decision sent Ricky, who was 15 years old, to this institution. There, he was labeled as emotionally handicapped, drug dependent, and antisocial. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and prescribed lithium, but he often escaped from the facility and eventually dropped out of school. After that, Ricky's path continued downhill as he embraced the street life. His parents were left wondering as months would pass by without any sign of him. He slept at friends' houses or built makeshift shelters deep in Azteca woods. Ricky used various drugs such as LSD, mescaline, and PCP. But drugs were not the only thing that changed him.
No, no, no. This is serious. Serious. We could make you delirious. Delirious. You should have a healthy fear of us. Fear of us. Too much of us is dangerous.
He also became interested in the occult and the mystical. He started to mix his hallucinations with his beliefs. The line between reality and the supernatural began to blur. Ricky liked to read books that were dark and creepy, such as the Necronomicon and the Satanic Bible. He would drop acid in Azteca and watch the trees move and talk to him. He thought he could hear spirits in their whispers. He listened to music by Ozzy Osbourne and Iron Maiden. He also wrote his own songs that he played on the guitar for his friends. Ricky was proud of his new spiritual path, and he let everyone know it. He would walk around town, chanting in Latin and telling stories of animal sacrifices. He would get high and wander around in Azteca, shouting, "I am Satan." Many ignored him, knowing that he liked to shock and scare people. And he was on PCP more often than not. But was he really a Satanist, or was he just a troubled teen with mental illness and addiction? One night in April 1984, the police found Ricky Kasso in a strange place. He was in an old cemetery, digging up a grave. He was trying to remove a body from the ground. The police searched him and found a paper in his pocket. It had a list of names. Lucifer, also known as Satan, the leader of hell, who represents evil and rebellion against God. Mammon, a demon who tempts people with greed and money. Asmodeus, a demon who is linked to lust, sin, and desire. Beelzebub, a demon who is called the Lord of the Flies, referring to decay, disease, and corruption. This made the scene even more disturbing. The police asked him what he was doing in the cemetery. He claimed he was a Satanist and he wanted to use the body for a dark ritual. They didn't find any proof that he took anything from the grave, so they only charged him with a minor crime for breaking public health rules. They gave him a court date, and they let him go. Gary Lauwers had a hard life growing up. He tried to fit in, but nothing seemed to work. His father was a banker who gave his kids nice things. But when Gary wore a shirt and blazer to school, the other kids made fun of him. They called him names and said he must be gay for wearing clothes like that. Gary had to deal with a lot of hate, and he needed a way to cope. Gary found an escape and a place to belong with marijuana. He smoked with other misfits who didn't judge him. But Gary didn't know at the time that this would lead him to cross paths with Ricky Kasso. Gary ran away from home so many times that his parents gave up on calling the cops. He was caught up in a wild life of crime and drugs. He and his friend Jimmy had a way of making money by stealing from boats and cars. They waited for the snow to come because then they could sneak into the boats that were docked for the winter. They also broke into cars and took whatever they could find inside. They used the money to buy drugs and booze. Ricky sold LSD and PCP to everyone, and Gary was one of his best customers. But one night at a party, Gary did something stupid. He stole 10 bags of PCP from Ricky's pocket when he was asleep. Someone saw him do it and told Ricky. Ricky was very angry and gave Gary a deadline: pay him back in 2 weeks or else. But Gary got lucky when Ricky got sick with pneumonia and had to go to the hospital. But that luck didn't last long. Ricky's mother wanted him to be placed in the psychiatric ward once he recovered physically. During the psychiatric evaluation, the doctors learned about Ricky's criminal charges and drug use. Ricky even told them that he would end his own life rather than go to jail. This only made the doctors suspicious, thinking he might be manipulating the situation to gain sympathy in family court. The hospital released him, saying that he did not exhibit acute psychosis, hallucinations, or delusions. They didn't know that they were making a big mistake. They didn't know that they were letting a killer go free. They didn't know that they were putting Gary in great danger. Ricky was furious when he saw Gary again. He attacked him and demanded his money back. Gary only had $30, which wasn't enough. Ricky warned him that he would come back for more soon. Gary was scared and bought a knife to defend himself. He stayed inside and tried to avoid Ricky for a few weeks. One day, Ricky showed up at Gary's door without warning. Gary's mother tried to defuse the situation. She gave Ricky $50 and asked him to forgive Gary. She hoped that they could just be friends again. Ricky seemed to agree and left peacefully, but he was still angry inside. He felt betrayed by Gary's theft. It wasn't just about the money. He wanted revenge. A few weeks later, Gary and Ricky ended up at the same party. Gary went up to Ricky and tried to give him some money, but Ricky didn't take it. He gave Gary some drugs instead. They decided to get some donuts and go hang out in Azteca Woods. Ricky Kasso, Gary Lauwer, Jimmy Troiano, and Albert Canones went into the forests, but Gary never came back out. The morning after, Ricky was back getting high just like every other day. Jimmy and Albert had seen firsthand how far Ricky could go and didn't want to get on his bad side, so they were laying low and keeping quiet. Plus, since Gary often ran away from home, maybe nobody would notice he was missing for a while. But Ricky wasn't shy about what he'd done. He made sure other people knew all about it. It was his way of sending a message. If you mess with Ricky Kasso, you're messing with the devil. Gary's disappearance did not go unnoticed by his probation officer, who realized he had not checked in for a while. There were rumors he had skipped town, but surprisingly, no one reported him missing and no one looked for him. His body lay rotting in the woods for weeks until someone anonymously tipped off the police. Meanwhile, Ricky and Jimmy bought a cheap car in New Jersey and planned to go to California. They had a stash of drugs they wanted to sell to finance the trip, and on Long Island they had lots of buyers. So they drove back to New York, not knowing that the police had found Gary's body, and that they had identified Ricky, Jimmy, and Albert as the main suspects in his murder. Albert Canones was the first one to be caught by the police. He quickly blamed Ricky and Jimmy for the murder. He said that Jimmy had started a fight over the drugs Gary stole and urged Ricky to cut Gary's throat. He told the police that Ricky had made Gary kneel down and had stabbed him over and over, shouting, "Say you love Satan." Gary's only words were, "I love you, Mom." In Jimmy's statement to the police, he initially admitted to being part of the murder, saying that he knew Gary had to die or he would rat them out if he lived, and that he didn't care because Gary had stolen from Ricky. He said he kicked Gary, breaking his ribs, and then held him while Ricky stabbed him. He said, quote, "Ricky was talking some shit about Satan over Gary's body. He's into stuff about Satan and the devil. I saw Gary move his head slightly, and Ricky bugged out and started stabbing Gary in the face. I don't know how many times, but it was a lot," end quote. He revised his statement several times and was assisting the police by going back to the crime scene to give authorities more details. Ricky admitted to the murder right away. He said that he, Jimmy, and Albert had talked about killing Gary earlier that night. Ricky told the police that he had stabbed Gary many times while Jimmy held him down. He said that he and Jimmy dragged Gary deeper into the woods and started to bury him, thinking he was dead. When Gary suddenly got up, Ricky freaked out and stabbed him multiple times in the face. Ricky said, quote, "I heard a crow caw, which is a sign of the devil. I knew then that Gary was dead." All three of them were charged with murder and held without bail pending a hearing the following week. But Ricky never faced a jury for the murder of Gary Lauwers. On July 7th, 1984, he died after hanging himself with a sheet in his cell. Albert Canones agreed to testify against Jimmy in exchange for immunity, but it wasn't as open and shut as you might think. Ricky's statement to police was not admissible in court. Under the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, as well as the right to a speedy trial and an impartial jury, A person has the right to be, quote, confronted with the witnesses against him, end quote. Many confrontation clause cases have gone to the Supreme Court, and through the years they have held to interpreting the Sixth Amendment literally. A statement made outside a court of law, meaning not under oath, is hearsay and therefore not admissible. On the stand, Jimmy recanted his earlier statements. He testified he had gaps in his memory due to the large amount of drugs he was on that night, and that the police had prompted him to fill in the blanks. Albert's testimony was called into question for the same reason. The statements of those high on hallucinogens were unreliable, which was enough to cast reasonable doubt, and the jury returned a not guilty verdict. Jimmy Troiano was acquitted of second-degree murder. Albert Canonis wrote a book only 2 months ago about his experience. He says he is haunted by the deaths and always asks himself if he could have done something different. He claims police beat him and forced him to sign a false statement. He also criticizes the media for sensationalizing the satanic cult angle. Do you think Ricky Kasso was a satanic killer or just a drug addict who lost control? Maybe a little of both? How do you react to the outcome of the trials? Let me know what you think, and thank you for your support.